Who deserves her millions? Grandma's startling inheritance test exposes greed. Margaret Donovan sat by the large bay window of her mansion, looking out at the lush garden she had tended to for decades. At 82 years old, she had seen her fair share of life's ups and downs. Once a poor girl from a small town, she had built her fortune brick by brick, through hard work, shrewd investments, and more than a few sleepless nights. But now, as she grew older, there was something that troubled her, something more pressing than her wealth. It wasn't that Margaret feared death. She had made peace with that long ago. What gnawed at her was a question of trust. Who, among her family, truly cared for her? Not for the money she could leave behind, but for the person she was. She had seen too many instances of greed, too many conversations peppered with subtle hints about inheritances and assets. So, one chilly autumn evening, Margaret made a decision. She would disguise herself as a beggar and visit each of her grandchildren. She wanted to see how they would treat her when they believed she had nothing to offer but an empty stomach and a worn-out coat. Margaret wasn't looking for perfection. She wanted to find the one grandchild whose heart was still pure, whose values aligned with the principles she had held close all her life: kindness, humility, and compassion. With a plan in mind, she prepared for her journey. It was unconventional, but Margaret Donovan had never been one for following the rules. Dressed in ragged clothes, Margaret made her way to her eldest granddaughter Sarah's home. Sarah lived in a spacious house in the suburbs, with a driveway full of cars and a perfectly manicured lawn. Margaret felt a pang of sadness as she approached the large wooden door. This was the same house she had helped Sarah and her husband buy. She knocked twice, the sound muffled by the cold wind. When Sarah opened the door, she looked the old woman up and down with a mix of suspicion and discomfort. "Can I help you?" she asked, keeping the door only half open. Margaret, her face hidden under layers of dirt and an old scarf, asked for food and a place to rest. Sarah glanced nervously inside, clearly eager to close the door. "I'm sorry, but we don't really take in strangers," she said, shifting uncomfortably. "I can give you some money if that helps." She quickly handed Margaret a crisp $20 bill and shut the door without another word. Margaret stood there for a moment, staring at the closed door. She pocketed the money, knowing Sarah meant well in her own way, but the coldness in her voice had cut through Margaret more than the wind ever could. The next day, Margaret made her way to her grandson Michael's high-rise apartment in the city. Michael had always been ambitious, the type to chase after the next big deal, the next investment opportunity. She was proud of his drive, but today wasn't about business. When she arrived, Michael was on his phone, pacing around his sleek, modern apartment. He barely looked at her when he opened the door, distracted by whatever deal was in progress on the other end of the line. Margaret, in her beggar's disguise, asked for a place to rest or something to eat. Michael paused his conversation for a second, gave her a quick glance, and pulled out his wallet. He handed her a few dollars and said, "Sorry, this is all I've got time for right now. Best of luck." And with that, he closed the door and resumed his call. Margaret's heart sank again. She wasn't there for charity. She was there for kindness, for human connection. But it seemed that to Michael, even helping a beggar was just another transaction. Next, Margaret journeyed to her granddaughter Rebecca's home. Rebecca was a single mother of 2 young children, living modestly in a small house just outside of town. Margaret knew Rebecca had struggled after her divorce, balancing work and raising her children, but she hoped to see some of the compassion she remembered in her. When Rebecca opened the door, she looked tired but smiled gently. "Oh dear, you look like you could use something warm," she said, ushering Margaret inside. She brought her to the kitchen and quickly prepared a sandwich and a cup of tea. But as they sat at the table, Margaret could sense the tension in the air. Rebecca's eyes kept darting to the front door, clearly uneasy with having a stranger in her home. "I wish I could let you stay longer, but with the kids here, I just have to be careful, you know," Rebecca said apologetically, wringing her hands. Margaret nodded, understanding. While Rebecca's generosity was evident, so was her fear. She had opened her door, but her heart was guarded. Margaret's final stop was her youngest grandson, David, who lived in a small house on the outskirts of town. David had always been different from the rest, quieter, more thoughtful. He had become a teacher, not for the money but for the love of helping others. Margaret hoped this final visit would be different from the others, but she prepared herself for the worst. When she knocked on David's door, he opened it with a warm smile. "Come in, please," he said without hesitation, helping her inside. "You must be cold. Let me get you something warm to eat." As they sat in his tiny kitchen, David listened to her story, though she was still in disguise, and offered her more than just food and shelter. He offered conversation, genuine interest, and kindness. He didn't treat her as a burden, nor did he seem in a rush to send her away. He treated her like a person, not a problem. Margaret knew, in that moment, that David was the one who truly understood the values she held dear. Several days after her visit to David's house, Margaret returned home, feeling both content and conflicted. Her plan had worked, but it left her with a heavy heart. Of her 4 grandchildren, only David had treated her with genuine kindness, without hesitation or ulterior motives. It was time for the next step. Margaret called a family meeting at her estate, inviting all her children and grandchildren. When they arrived, there was a noticeable tension in the air. The grandchildren were curious as to why she had summoned them all so suddenly, while her children exchanged nervous glances, wondering if this was about her will. As everyone settled into the grand living room, Margaret entered. She stood before them, not as the beggar they had seen days before, but as the wealthy matriarch of the family. After a long pause, she began to speak. "I've lived a long life, and I've seen the world in ways that few people get to experience," Margaret started, her voice steady but laced with emotion. "But I've come to realize that the greatest wealth is not in what we own, but in how we treat others." Her grandchildren listened, puzzled by her words. Then, with a calm but serious tone, Margaret revealed her secret. "Recently, I visited each of you, disguised as a beggar. I wanted to see how you would treat a stranger, someone who had nothing to offer you but their need for help." There was a collective gasp in the room. Sarah, Michael, Rebecca, and David stared at her, their faces a mixture of shock and confusion. Margaret watched them closely, letting the weight of her words sink in. The room was silent, and Margaret could feel the discomfort swirling around her. Sarah was the first to speak, her face flushed. "Grandma, I didn't know it was you. I thought it was just someone looking for handouts. I didn't mean to be rude." Her voice cracked with embarrassment, but her defense felt hollow. Michael shifted in his seat, his jaw tight. "If I'd known it was you, I would have invited you in, of course. But I was busy, I didn't have time for—" He stopped, realizing how poor his excuse sounded. Rebecca's eyes filled with tears. "I'm so sorry, Grandma. I wanted to help more, but I was scared, for the kids. I didn't know what to do. I should have trusted my instincts." Margaret listened to each of them, her heart softening despite their flaws. She knew that fear, pride, and self-interest often clouded people's better judgment. But she also knew that actions speak louder than words. David remained silent, his face solemn. He understood now what had happened during that night when his beggar grandmother had knocked on his door. He had no regrets, and there was no need for excuses. "I'm not here to make any of you feel guilty," Margaret continued, her gaze sweeping the room. "But I wanted to see what was in your hearts, not your words. I've already made my decision." Margaret took a deep breath, feeling the eyes of her family locked on her. "I've rewritten my will," she said, her voice firm. "David will inherit the bulk of my estate." The silence in the room deepened, and she could feel the shock ripple through her grandchildren. Sarah's mouth opened in disbelief, Michael shifted uncomfortably in his chair, and Rebecca seemed on the verge of protest. But before anyone could speak, Margaret raised her hand. "I know this might be hard for some of you to understand, but I want you to know why I made this choice. David, without knowing who I was, opened his heart and his home to me. He didn't treat me as a burden or a stranger. He showed kindness, empathy, and respect, values that I hold dear." Margaret turned to David, who was sitting quietly, humbled by her words. "David, you reminded me of something important, that compassion and humanity are far more valuable than any fortune. And I trust you to use what I leave behind to continue spreading those values." Tears welled up in Rebecca's eyes, but she nodded slowly, realizing the truth in her grandmother's words. Sarah and Michael sat in stunned silence, still trying to process what they had just heard. Margaret continued, softening her tone as she addressed the others. "That doesn't mean I don't care for the rest of you. I've left each of you something, a portion of my estate. But what I truly hope is that this experience teaches you something more valuable than money." She looked at her grandchildren, her eyes filled with love and understanding. "I hope you learn to treat everyone with kindness, no matter what they look like or how much they have. That's the legacy I want to leave behind. Not just wealth, but the importance of compassion." Sarah and Michael, both still processing the loss of the larger inheritance, lowered their heads. It wasn't an easy pill to swallow, but they understood that their grandmother's decision came from a place of wisdom and love. David, meanwhile, felt a mix of gratitude and responsibility. He hadn't expected any of this, and the weight of his grandmother's trust in him felt both humbling and profound. He knew he had to honor her wishes in more ways than just managing the money. He had to live by the values she cherished. As the weeks passed, the family adjusted to the new reality. Margaret's health began to decline, and David visited her often, caring for her as she grew weaker. His siblings, too, visited more frequently, each of them reflecting on their actions and striving to show their grandmother the love she had longed for. Margaret spent her final days in peace, surrounded by family. She had always been strong and self-reliant, but in those last moments, she allowed herself to lean on the people she loved, knowing she had set things right. On a quiet winter afternoon, Margaret passed away in her sleep, her hand resting in David's as he sat by her bedside. The family gathered to say their goodbyes, not with heavy hearts, but with gratitude for the time they had with her and the lessons she had imparted. In the days following Margaret's passing, her family gathered at the mansion for the reading of the will. The house felt quieter without her presence, but there was a warmth among the family that hadn't been there before. Her grandchildren, especially Sarah, Michael, and Rebecca, had spent the last few weeks reflecting on their grandmother's test and what it had revealed about each of them. They were nervous as the lawyer began to read the will, but it was more than just the financial aspects on their minds. Each of them wondered how their actions had impacted their relationships, not only with Margaret but also with each other. The will was simple and direct, just like Margaret herself. As promised, the bulk of her estate went to David, including the family mansion and a significant portion of her financial assets. The other grandchildren were left with smaller but still generous sums, enough to secure their futures. There were no complaints or protests. In fact, a sense of acceptance settled over the room. Margaret had made her wishes clear, and her family, despite their initial shock, respected her decision. Sarah and Michael, though disappointed, had come to understand that their grandmother's choice wasn't about punishing them, it was about rewarding true character. With his newfound inheritance, David felt a mixture of emotions. The mansion, once a symbol of his grandmother's strength and determination, now belonged to him. But with that ownership came a responsibility far greater than maintaining the property or managing the money. He knew that his grandmother had entrusted him with something far more valuable, her legacy of kindness, humility, and compassion. David didn't change his lifestyle drastically. He remained the same humble schoolteacher, though he did begin using part of his inheritance to support local charities and educational programs, things he knew his grandmother would have approved of. He also reached out to his siblings, inviting them to help in these efforts. He wanted them to feel included, to understand that wealth, when used wisely, could bring about positive change for others. Sarah, Michael, and Rebecca accepted his invitation, eager to honor their grandmother's memory in a meaningful way. They began working together on charitable initiatives, and in the process, they found their relationships healing. The tension and rivalry that had once existed between them slowly faded, replaced by a renewed sense of family unity. Months passed, and as the family settled into their new lives, David took time to reflect on the journey they had all been through. Margaret's wealth had once seemed like a looming shadow, casting doubt and greed into the hearts of those around her. But now, with her gone and the money dispersed, it felt less like a burden and more like an opportunity to do good in the world. David decided to sell the mansion. While it held many memories, it was too large and impractical for him to live in alone. He found peace in the decision, knowing that the proceeds from the sale would go toward funding the charitable causes he and his family had begun to support. He kept a few personal items: Margaret's favorite chair, a photo album filled with family memories, but the rest was given away, just as Margaret had intended. As time went on, the family gatherings became more frequent. What had once been occasional visits now became regular traditions, with Sarah, Michael, Rebecca, and David all making a conscious effort to stay connected. The rivalry and competition that had once defined their relationships were replaced by mutual respect and genuine care for one another. Rebecca, in particular, found herself reflecting on her grandmother's lesson. As a single mother, she had always been cautious and protective, but Margaret's test had reminded her that sometimes it's important to take risks, to open your heart, even when it feels vulnerable. She began teaching her children about kindness and generosity, using the story of their great-grandmother as an example of what it meant to live a life of purpose. Sarah and Michael, too, softened in their approach to life. They became more involved in their communities, offering their time and resources to those in need, rather than focusing solely on their own ambitions. Slowly but surely, Margaret's values began to shape the lives of her entire family. Years later, David stood at his grandmother's grave, a cool breeze rustling the leaves around him. He closed his eyes and remembered the night she had come to him as a beggar, her face hidden beneath the layers of grime and exhaustion. At the time, he had no idea who she was, but he had treated her the way he believed anyone should be treated, with kindness and respect. Now, standing there, he understood the true depth of the lesson she had tried to teach them all. Life, he realized, wasn't about wealth, status, or material possessions. It was about the relationships you build, the people you help, and the kindness you show along the way. Margaret had known that better than anyone, and she had spent her final years ensuring her family learned it too. David smiled softly, placing a single flower on her grave. "Thank you, Grandma," he whispered, "for everything." As he turned to leave, a sense of peace washed over him. He carried with him the wisdom of a woman who had lived a long, fulfilling life, one built not on the foundation of riches, but on the solid ground of love, compassion, and humility. And as he walked away from the grave, David knew that his grandmother's legacy would live on, not just in the wealth she had passed down, but in the values she had instilled in all of them.